Dr. Norbert from Tufts University, Norbert Wilson from Tufts University, in the Food Policy Friedman School of Nutrition Science. We'll be talking a little bit about how food labels influence food waste, food purchase, and elimination of products from your kitchen, correct? Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to the organizers and the invitation to participate in this National Academy of Science Food Forum. I've changed my title just a touch, and so Heather, please forgive me. And it's innovations to mitigate food loss, and I gotta say I overlooked the loss part, and ways from the farmer to the consumer. So, as we've heard over the last day, and as you've probably watched in the news and heard in many different places, food waste is a significant issue. I see some folks laughing at the fact that I had to include loss, so I appreciate that. It has been estimated to be between 30 to 50%, and the range in terms of just a physical quantity is about 39 to 79 million metric tons. And Steve presented REFED's numbers for sort of total food loss that occurs in the food system. But if you look at a particular sector, and that's where I'm going to spend some of my time, is on produce and vegetables. If you just looked at specifications, sort of like the shape, the color, the size, they estimate $277 million worth of diverted food. So food loss and waste occurs throughout the supply chain, and the question is, how do we help prevent this? So there has been some conversation around, well, how much food loss actually does occur, how much food waste occurs. And so Lisa Johnson, who is a PhD student, now is, I think, a postdoc or maybe even a faculty member out at North Carolina State University, did some analysis. She went out throughout the state of North Carolina, worked with small and medium-sized growers, and evaluated with a fairly rigorous method food loss of marketable and edible foods. And I'm not going to go through each crop and each in detail, but I want you just to see how much variation there is, and the product that is lost, that is left, that is completely marketable, that is, it meets grade, but for whatever reason was left in the field, or maybe didn't meet grade, but was left in the field and not consumed or not used. So we're even upwards of 100%. There was also a study that was just released by Greg Baker out at Santa Clara University and his colleagues, and I realize this may be a little bit small. I just want you to look at this, there. This column here, and what it shows you, this is out in California, and you can see percentages as high as over 100% because of the way they measure, to as low as 5%. So a great deal of variation in the crop that is left in the field through walk-bys, that is, when a farmer chooses not to harvest the product or otherwise. And I want to be really clear about one thing. I'll be clear about that in just a second, speaking specifically of farmers. So I was preparing this and realized that the National Academy of Science did this wonderful report back in 2015 looking at the food system, and they looked specifically at the food supply chain. And I want to use this as an organizing framework to look at different parts of the supply chain. We have Steve, who gave a great presentation about the about the food service sector, so I'm not going to talk about that. We have someone coming up, Rhonda from the food bank in Arizona, and she's going to talk about that sector. But I do want to talk about a few places along this chain and identify some opportunities, or identify places where loss occurs, where waste may occur at the consumer level, and then talk about a few innovations that have been helpful to help mitigate some of this loss. And I will say some of these are new and interesting and surprising, and some are as old as the Bible. So I do want to hit on a few things. All right, so let's talk about farm and farm production first and foremost. And I love this image of grades and standards for strawberries. So some of this report or this presentation is based out of work I did with the Economic Research Service. They had this large cooperative agreement to look at food loss and waste from at the farm through to the retail dock. And so I'll be referencing some of the material I used in the case study on strawberries, so you'll see a lot of strawberries, so forgive me. And then I also did a bit of work on food loss and innovations to mitigate that loss. And I will say I did use some work that Brenna Ellison has in this same report. So this, I'll make reference to this image in a moment. If you look at strawberries, this is a crop that's grown throughout the U.S., but most of it comes out of California. There is a growing share of product that comes out of Mexico, but I won't worry about that international trade implications there. And growers are doing the very best that they can to provide crops. And I want to be very clear. I realize that when we think about food loss and waste, sometimes I think we can be a little careless, and not think that people are doing the very best that they can. And I would argue that growers are trying to manage a lot of different competing forces to make sure they get crop and that they're profitable. And so when growers realize that their crop is ready, they make decisions about bringing harvesters in to harvest the crop, and they're dealing with a lot of different factors, fruit maturity, and this is not just at the field level, but this is even at the plant level, issues around quality, going back to that image before, and prices and labor availability. So strawberries is a crop that growers will repeatedly harvest over a period of time, and they're having to make decisions even at the plant level of whether or not to harvest the product. And one of the things that's important is to make sure that you're harvesting products that can survive the transportation, but also that is of the right quality so that you don't lose out on market opportunities. And they're dealing with the issue of prices. Prices do fluctuate, and here's a great example of this. This is average prices in the U.S. Of strawberries throughout the year. I have selected years, and the point I want to make here is that what growers try to avoid are these low price when the price bottoms out. And this is a bit aggregate, so it's not showing the variation that occurs on a day-to-day basis or even weekly basis. But you can understand here that if a farmer harvests at the wrong time, they may end up at the low price, or if they wait a little bit longer, and there's some methods to actually help extend the production so they could possibly get a higher price later, they may miss out. So growers have a real challenge of trying to time the market perfectly. And ways of helping them deal with some of the issues of quality standards. As I showed you in that earlier image of quality standards, which came from USDA, AMS, the Ag Marketing Service, where there were certain quality standards that growers are expected to meet, at least for the for federal reasons. But then grocery manufacturers and large companies like Driscoll's have very high standards that exceed probably the ones that we saw earlier. So one of the things that's happened is that there have been a number of innovations in improved varieties. I'm not even speaking of genetic modification. I'm talking about traditional crossbreeding to come up with hardier varieties, ones that can sustain pests and diseases, that can manage water, either lack of or too much. And so this is something that companies like Driscoll's and others, the universities throughout the U.S. are working on improving varieties, as we saw from Jill's presentation yesterday. And another way that improvement of varieties plays out is in helping with the facilitation of shipping so that products can be shipped much further. As you can imagine, California shipping strawberries throughout the U.S., you need a strawberry that's going to last, that's going to hold up. And lastly, this idea of better timing so that crops are ready at the same time, and then when they're ready that they can, or that they're available throughout different parts of the season so that farmers can attain the highest price possible. I'm going to skip over controlled environments. It is important. It's a growing area, but I won't talk about that today, but I'll gladly answer questions if you have those later. But here's an old solution. It's gleaning. And we have someone from the food bank that's going to talk about what Feeding America and its organizations deal with. But I want to talk about gleaning, which is this ancient tradition, and it's a key part of the agricultural poor laws of the Bible. And yes, my Sunday school teacher is happy about me presenting this. But gleaning is a tradition that was created to help feed the poor, but it has evolved to actually be used in our modern day. And there are about 282 groups that have been registered as gleaners in the National Gleaning Project. Interestingly, it's not a well-researched area, so to the researchers in the room, there may be some opportunities there. One of the largest gleaning organizations out there is Society of St. Andrews, and they reported that they recovered about 28.5 million pounds of produce from 916 different providers, and that's small. They're doing good work, but it takes effort. And I will argue that one of the challenges that gleaners face, and Lisa Johnson noted this in in North Carolina, is that gleaners often have a difficult time accessing farms. There are lots of complicated relationships, and there are some reasons that happens. Another innovation that's out of the charitable food sector, but in the private sector, and it makes me think of some of the work that LeanPath is doing. There are a number of these organizations that are called commercial peer-to-peer mutualization systems, which is basically like Uber or Airbnb, these organizations that are part of the gig economy. And there are a number of these companies that are engaging in food waste where they're able to collect product that might not have been marketed. Maybe they're perfectly fine, maybe they misgrade, whatever the case may be, but they're being aggregated and sold out through an app as a CSA type product, a community supported agriculture type product. Tim Richardson and Steve Hamilton have done some interesting work in this space, and they were actually looking at how do you actually help these firms. One, is there a case for it? And two, could there be ways of improving the efficiency of these organizations? I will say that with many solutions, there are some challenges and controversies. This article came out of The Atlantic earlier this year, and it's basically questioning whether or not some of these firms are doing a good job. Are the benefits being distributed equally throughout the system? Are people actually profiting off of errors, and is that a problem? I'm not going to get into the details of it, but just suffice it to say that there are some concerns around this particular area. So let's move on to the logistics part of the supply chain. And there are a number of ways that product can be lost along the supply chain. And one of the big areas, especially with fresh fruits and vegetables, is failure in the cold chain. So this failure in the cold chain can lead to loss of quality, shortened shelf life, and in some products can actually have some food safety concerns. Gunders, in her earlier report in 2012, argued that about 12% of food is lost because of poor refrigeration. And some of the work I was doing with strawberries indicated that strawberries, when there are temperature fluctuations, can not only affect the color, but also obviously affect other parts of the quality. And so there are a number of mechanisms and innovations that various farmers and industry thinkers have come up with. Of course, things like forced air tunnels and cold walls that really reduce the temperature of strawberries quickly, because strawberries, once harvested, are immediately put into the clamshell, the little plastic container, and then put on pallets. And because of that, you need to have a very careful mechanism to cool the product down and make sure that it's moving and kept at an appropriate temperature. And this technology is not new, but it's one that's constantly evolving and finding new ways. And one of the ways is even just in the management. So this idea of moving away from first in and first out to mitigate waste, rather using first expired, first out as a way of helping organize supplies move through products so that you can optimize the shelf life of those products. And there have been, as we saw yesterday with packaging, but also specifically or directly with the fresh fruits and vegetables, this idea of using radio frequency ID, RFID tags, and other monitoring and sensors to evaluate temperature, pH level, even the gases in the product, to make sure that you can detect problems and move product quickly if there is a problem. The retail foods sector is one where there is some level of innovation, and you probably have heard of some of these initiatives. There was a lot of excitement around ugly produce, and a number of grocery store chains have went out and came up with new marketing techniques around ugly produce. And I'm sure you've seen all of the wonderful Instagram images of cute carrots and other ways. And so companies like Hannaford, Kroger, Walmart had different efforts to deal with misfits or or what have you. But there was a report in 2019 that some of these grocery stores have actually dropped some of these techniques, seeing that consumers may not have been as interested as they had thought. I have a colleague, Maurizio Canavari, who did some work in Italy looking at misshapen fruit and argued that the willingness to pay just wasn't there. So there may be more opportunities, but I think this is a space that we need to think about a little bit more. There is an organization out in the Boston, Massachusetts area, Dorchester and Roxbury, called Daily Table. It's a nonprofit grocery store that found products that might have been wasted or products near date that they were able to bring into the grocery store to serve low-income communities. And it's a different method than other forms of charitable food sector to actually get food out to underserved communities. This is an organization that's led by Doug Rao, who was the former CEO of Trader Joe's. And actually have gone shopping. It's open to anyone, and it's a pretty amazing setup. Last on the supply chain is the consumer. And as you can see, what this whole food system, food supply or supply chain is supposed to represent is farm production at the farm that moves product information and services all the way to the consumer, and the consumer can, in theory, send information back to the farmer and thus ultimately influence the input supplies. I would argue that that flow of information may not always happen. I want to make a point about that at the very end. So I actually got involved in the food waste and food loss area because of packaging and labeling issues. And I actually got involved in this because of some work that Ronnie Neff did that I saw at a conference, and I went back to Brad Rickard, who's going to speak next, and said, I think we can do something in this space. And so this is the first paper that we published in this area, where we're looking at the role of date labels and package size and how that influences food waste. And what we were able to see is that labels do matter. I mean, we know the work that Emily Brotlieb and others have done suggests that consumers are confused by these labels. And what we were able to show through experimental settings is that not only do the labels matter, but it could also be the actual size of the package. And if we could find innovative ways of reducing or changing the package size, we might actually see a reduction in waste, or at least perceptions about what waste would be. Some work that I've done with my colleague Riking Miao, who's at Auburn University, and a student that Brad and I both share, Carter Weiss. We were looking through an experiment, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. We were looking at how consumers understand the different date labels, and what we saw across different products, the same label could mean different things. And so the work that Brenna Ellison presented yesterday about context mattering, well, we saw that the context of the product actually even matters in terms of how people perceive what they're going to waste. So if we're going to have food waste changes, we've got to think about how consumers are looking at those labels. And there is work afoot that's looking at this particular issue. So the Grocery Manufacturer Association and Food Marketing Institute, FMI and GMA have worked with their members to actually change the way we see date labels. You could find in the marketplace, the state of Alabama, for example, in the law would allow for 21 different date labels used by Best Buy, Fresh Buy, you name it. And the argument is that consumers are confused by this number of date labels. And so what FMI and GMA have encouraged is to reduce the number of labels to a safety label, used by, and a quality label, Best Buy. And I'm going to argue in a second about what that could possibly do. There is current legislation in the Congress. I think I just saw this last week. Representative Pingree is reintroducing a federal law to actually follow up with this. Some work I'm doing, and I realize I may not have, I'll try to quickly explain this graph, and if I don't, I'll just at least give you the overview. The point we were looking at with Riking Mao and Carter Weiss was we were looking at how consumers respond to different date labels when for different products. And what we were interested in understanding is, are they responding, and what was their response even when there wasn't a date label? And so what we saw is that consumers thought they would waste between 15 to 30% of the product when you just put the date, which was something that you would find in the marketplace, not an unusual date, and just a general description. When you added the date label, best by or used by, you could see, depending on the product, an increase in waste or actually a decrease in waste. And we were really surprised by that. The other thing I would argue, and that we found, is that it depended on who the person was. And so we use this measure of loss aversion, which, if you're interested in behavioral economics, we can talk about that later, but the idea that there are different people who respond to losses differently. And what we saw is that waste changed, or at least the perception or prediction of waste changed, depending on their loss aversion. The long and the short is, depending on who the consumer is, we may see different responses to changes in date labels. So just a quick assessment of what I've presented. Food loss and waste occur throughout the supply chain, and this loss and waste is highly variable by products, and there are a number of solutions to this problem. New market structures, charitable institutions, new technologies, but we must understand that there are challenges and unintended consequences. And lastly, we see that date labels could and do have an effect on how people perceive about food waste, but we have to be careful about the solutions we come up with. My last point, as I see my time is slipping away, is that these solutions, we've tended to look at particular nodes in the supply chain and say, oh, if we fix this problem, we fix the problem. What we failed to do, I believe, is understand this in terms of a system dynamics. And we're failing to appreciate the feedback loops that may exist. And I think if we take a broader system dynamics view, we may be able to come closer at solving some of these challenges. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Norbert.